I thought what I would do is just tell you folks a little bit about Airmail background. In May of this year, Larry Tobin, who's in attendance here today, and Ben Scott and I flew with Jeff Hamilton from San Diego to Seattle and reenacted CAM 8, that's Contract Airmail Route 8, and did 11 original city stops and kind of did this program I'm going to do for you now at each of those city stops. In 2008, Larry Tobin and I flew the transcontinental airmail route from New York to San Francisco, 15 city stops with the Boeing 40. Larry in the C-3B that's here at the museum. That's the oldest flying serial number 4 Stearman in existence. Our Boeing 40, the oldest flying Boeing of any airplane in the world, and Ben Scott's Speedmail. And that was quite heartwarming. Unfortunately, on the way home from Portland after that flight, Larry crashed in the Columbia Gorge by Wind Mountain, about 10 miles up the river. We had left Portland that morning, and about Cascade Locks, his engine started stumbling, and he had literally less than 50 seconds from the time the engine quit to go into the trees. So that was a very emotional few minutes, and we have that September 20th, 2008 date burned in infamy. We never forget that. We call each other every day at 9, 10 in the morning on the 20th of September every year and remember those few minutes. And I came to WAM Museum and waited for Larry to arrive. And there was emotion, and we were all very quiet. And that was that day. The airplane's since been restored, and it's here at the museum today. This facility is amazing, and we are excited to be part of that. Let me take you back to 1918, and let's talk about airmail prior to that date was moved around the country primarily by rail. And there was kind of a visionary in the post office, a man named Otto Praeger. And Praeger recognized the aeronautical contributions that World War I had made. And there were a number of surplus de Havilland DH-4 bombers that were then converted to mailplanes. And Otto Praeger said, I can move airmail around the country much faster by air than I can by rail. And at that time, it took 72 hours to move a letter from New York to San Francisco. And the goal was to get that time down to under 30 hours, cut that in half by using the airmail. To prove his point, he went to Congress in 1918 in April and got appropriations to do an experiment. And they were going to run airmail initially from Washington, D.C. to New York. And the amazing part of the story is they tapped a man named Reuben H. Fleet on the shoulder. And remember, May of 1918, World War I was still in full swing. And Reuben H. Fleet was in charge of 30 trading bases all over the country. He didn't want to deal with airmail, but they tapped him on the shoulder and they said, by the way, you got 3 weeks to create and demonstrate feasibility of airmail from Washington, D.C. to New York. So he comes out of this meeting and picks the telephone up and calls the Curtiss Aircraft Company. They take 5 Curtiss Jennies off the line and re-engine them with 150 horsepower Tissot engines in lieu of the OX-5. Took the front seat out, put a mail pit in, and within 3 weeks he certainly had an airplane ready. That May 13 morning, Woodrow Wilson showed up, the President of the U.S. Otto Praeger was there, lots of fanfare, and due to political influence, the man in the seat of that airplane that day was a guy named George Boyle, who had graduated from flight school 3 weeks earlier. He had 60 hours. And Fleet said that probably wasn't a good idea. And basically the boss said, that's going to be my son-in-law, and he's going to be on the seat where you're getting money. So they put George in the airplane, and Woodrow Wilson was standing around, and they propped this Jenny for 45 minutes. It wouldn't start. And the President, Woodrow Wilson, said, is there any gas in the airplane? And certainly they found the gas tank was empty. So they put gas in the airplane. And old George took off and broke ground, and all he had to do was follow the railroad tracks to Philadelphia and then on to New York. Well, he followed the wrong railroad tracks and went south instead of north. He went 25 miles south of Washington, D.C., landed in fields with the airplane on his back. And that's as far as the mail got that day. It was finished by mail. So the next day they gave George another try, and he wrecked another airplane. And that was the end of George's airmail career. So that's in May. Let's think about that little funny story, and that's a true story. They did run mail successfully every day thereafter from D.C. to New York for a few months. By September of that year, Max Miller was hired by Otto Praeger. He decided it's probably a good idea to get some seasoned pilots rather than these brand new flight school guys. So let's get some people that have some experience. And Max Miller was quite an experienced pilot. Hamilton Lee, Jack Knight, a whole Wild Bill Hobson, some really noted airmail pilots were then hired. And the thing that to me that's quite significant, by September of that year, Max Miller flew successfully from New York all the way to Cleveland. I mean, we're talking May and September, they're going to Cleveland. By 1919, they were going from New York to San Francisco in Curtis Jenny's and the DHs. We're talking less than 9 calendar months they're going coast to coast. The problem was they could only fly airmail by day. So at that point, the airmail was flown by day in the airplanes and traveled by rail by night. So Otto wasn't getting his 30-hour magic transition point. In 1921, they successfully said, you know, we can run airmail day and night. Let's go to Congress and see if they'll appropriate what was then called. Oh, you found the picture. Oh, that's a
No,
picture.
that's not it.
Well, that's a good picture.
Yeah.
The man in the airplane, that's not George Clooney, that's me. And I'll get one question off the table. I am married, just so you know, right off the table. And I want to note as well, the people that sit in the back are typically the troublemakers, so I'm watching every one of these guys. So in 1921, Otto Prager said, he'll go to Congress, and Congress said, we have to demonstrate the feasibility. And I want you to move a letter from coast to coast, and I want you to do this in under 32 hours. And so Otto Prager got 2 pilots in San Francisco with 2 de Havilland DH-4s and 2 de Havilland DH-4s in New York. The New York airplane started west. They got about halfway between Bellefonte and Cleveland and had to land because of weather, and those airplanes were out of the picture. The 2 West Coast airplanes took off, headed eastbound. They got to Elko, Nevada, and the number 2 airplane took off and had a stall spin fatality on takeoff. The last remaining airplane arrived at North Platte at midnight, and with a broken tail skid, which they then repaired. And in the seat arrives our hero, Jack Knight. And Jack Knight gets in the airplane. And Jack Knight flew from North Platte to Omaha every day as an airmail pilot. He knew every piece of topography intimately. He knew every fence line, every outhouse, every farmhouse. He knew that route like the back of his hand. So Jack Knight takes off at about 1:30 in the morning, and he heads to Omaha successfully and lands. And the weather is deteriorating. He's got about 12-foot overcast and about 3 miles of visibility, maybe 10. And the relief pilot that was then to fly his route from Omaha to Iowa City and then on to Chicago says, well, I'm not flying, the weather's too bad. Well, Jack Knight had never flown from Omaha to Chicago in his life. Well, this was national news. The AP had released, this was a big deal. And the chilling part of the story is every farmhouse and every car headlight all the way from Omaha to San Francisco lit a light lineup for Jack Knight. I mean, bonfires at car headlights and people with flashlights in the backyard. True story. And Jack Knight landed at Checkboard Field at sunrise that day with about an 800-foot ceiling and 2 miles of visibility. The airplane then continued on to New York, and they did that successfully in 29 hours, which I think is pretty. This is 1921. It was done on President's Day, February, whatever that is, 20 whatever. And that was Congress's criterion. They wanted to pick the worst weather day of the year, statistically, and this picked President's Day. So with that said, the light line was then appropriated. By 1925, there was an airway beacon every 10 miles from New York to San Francisco, 240 of them. Pretty significant. Think about all the ladies in nightgowns that crawled up mountaintops to keep airway beacons running, because the husbands wouldn't get out of bed. That probably happened. I met a really neat lady a number of years ago who was at one of these airway beacon service stations, and I got a picture of her at 15 years old wearing saddle shoes and a dress, climbing up a pole, knocking the ice off of an anemometer, and I gave her a ride in the 40, and she remembers the 40s coming in to that field when she was 15 years old. And she wrote a book for me after this, and I still have it as a treasure. So with that said, the lifeline was then successful. In 1925, the airmail decided the DH-4s really weren't doing the job, and they went out to contract. So we want a better airplane. Boeing, Curtiss, Fairchild, and Douglas all submitted airplanes. The airplane that was the World Cruiser was translated into an M2 mailplane and won that contract. So the first mailplane, other than a used military airplane, was the M2 Douglas airplane. That was in 1925. Boeing submitted an airplane called the Boeing 40, And the Boeing 40 had a wooden fuselage, and by contract had a Liberty V12 engine, which Boeing never really liked. And he lost the contract. That Boeing 40 was kind of a disaster. About 10 hours in service, the fuselage cracked and the engine was unreliable. Moving ahead, by 1926, Congress then decided that they were going to let the airmail go to private enterprise. And that's where the contract airmail route system came of age. The first contract airmail route was assigned CAM 5, and that was from, believe it or not, Pasco, Washington, to Elko, and then on to Salt Lake. And that was flown by a man named Lee Cuddybuck on March 6, 1926. I recreated that flight for May Lynn at Berkshire Aviation. The airmail came that morning on Stagecoach, and when I did that flight in 1999, they brought the airmail to me in the Stagecoach, which was really cool for that route. So with all that said, moving ahead, these CAM routes spouted up all over the country, and Bill Boeing seized the moment. He took the Boeing 40 and built the Boeing 40A, which then had a Pratt & Whitney engine, and appreciate that Bill Boeing had a very close relationship with a man named Fred Rensler. Fred Rensler was the president of the Wright Aircraft Company engine. They were building the Whirlwind that Lindbergh flew to New York with, but they were limited to about 220 horsepower. And Rensler appreciated the Europeans were quite a bit ahead of the Americans. They were building some magnificent airplanes. Bristol Aircraft Engine Company was building a 900 horsepower radio by coincidence. The Germans had built an airplane called the DX-10 with 8 engines that actually flew from Germany to Buenos Aires and New York in 1924. So the Europeans were building pretty significant engines, and Rensler decided, you know, Curtiss Wright had better step up to the plate and build a bigger engine. And he went to his stockholders and they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're happy. We don't make any money. So he quit and started the Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Engine Company. And this is the really cool part of the story. Pen to paper in January of 1925, and they had an airplane engine running. The first 1340 Pratt & Whitney was running in the test cell Christmas Eve of that year. Within one calendar year, there were 100 Curtiss O2Us flying behind Pratt & Whitney 1340 engines. And Bill Boeing and Rensler were buddies, and Bill Boeing was the only one that could get Pratt & Whitney engines. So this Boeing 40A was the first engine, Pratt & Whitney engine for a non-military application. And Bill Boeing said, instead of carrying water for the Liberty engine, I'm going to put an air-cooled Pratt & Whitney engine that I could now get, and I want to carry people inside. This was the first airplane in the U.S. that carried people and airmail. It predates the Ford Trimotor as the first airmail carrier in the U.S. And that lives here at the river in our backyard, which is really heartwarming. That makes everybody feel good, I think. And Gene Morrow's husband was very instrumental. He found my airplane for me on the mountain. He knew exactly where it was. I met him in Cottage Grove in 1992. And he walked up and said, you know, 5339 is sitting on a hill in Cottage Grove, and I know exactly where it is. And got hooked up with Tim Allen in the group, and that's how we ended up with the airplane that restored it. So with that said, let's understand the contribution that these airmail pioneers did for the airspace system that we enjoy today. Every one of these airmail carriers transitioned to the airlines that we know today. Every airmail carrier that received a contract airmail route morphed into American Airlines, United, American, every air carrier we know today started out that way. Interestingly enough, by 1934, the airmail was heavily subsidized by the government. And these airmail carriers, to make money, were carrying bricks and bags of sand because they wouldn't make any money flying in the airplanes. And Congress decided, you know, this is not a good idea, and they canceled all the airmail contracts in 1934. It was a travesty. And decided to give the airmail to the Army Air Corps. And they killed 34 guys in 61 days. And they decided maybe these airmail guys know what they're doing. So maybe we should re-let those contracts back. And hence, American Airways became American Airlines, Boeing Air Transport, National Air Transport, Pacific Air Transport, and National all morphed and put to stay United Airlines. And that's where United came from. If you look at a United captain, he's got 4 stars. And those 4 stars, correct, yeah, 4 stars are representing those initial airmail carriers of that day. And the rest is history. Of course, the DC-3 came along, the Boeing 247s, and these old, wonderful wooden winged steel tube fabric airplanes had a very brief time in history, which at one time were very much state-of-the-art of the airmail world that we lead today. So with that said, I promised you 15 minutes of talking. I can answer a few questions, and then I was going to go out to the airplane and point out a few details about the Boeing 40. So anyway, nice to see a lot of people in this room. That's a big part of that project. We had, just to digress for a moment, the airplane that I'm going to show you outside, after it was discovered, I spent 18 years looking for it, from 1980 until 1998. And it was in 2000 that we made a deal with the Oregon Aviation Historical Society who had recovered the airplane. It was in a horse trailer in just north of Roseburg, Oregon. And we made a trade with a promise that we would bring the airplane back to its original livery, and we promised that we would campaign the airplane aggressively all over the nation to tell this pioneer airmail story, which I think we've been diligent about doing. And then my dream was that the airplane would be preserved and shared, for the rest of our generations. And I'm very pleased that both my boys will continue to operate the airplane. You sit back. The airplane has no incidents, so it flies in level flight with 3 degrees of nose high attitude. So I have no forward visibility even in cruise flight. If I want to see forward, I have to stuff the nose over. You notice my landing here at Hood River, because the runway is kind of narrow and the approach is a little bit challenging for that airplane. I have to do a very aggressive slip on final. We have no forward visibility. I kick the slip out, pick up runway edges. Sometimes you'll see me slide left to find some black, and slide right to find a little black, kind of guess where the middle is and stick it on. And then you'll see me jack the tail up for a second just to get situational awareness. You saw the power off, you fly the tail down, and if you don't hear any bad noises, you're probably staying on the runway, which is a good sign. The airplane has remarkable runway handling. It goes down the runway like an arrow. It does have a locking tail wheel. It originally had a tail skid. The only thing we deviated technologically with the airplane is we run a very modern, we call it an oiler 1340, exactly what you find in the front of an AT-6. The original 1340s were stamp caps or greasers. They had to actually grease the rockers every 5 hours. And TBO on those engines was 200 hours. TBO on a modern oiler 1340A and 1 is 1600, so that's really nice. The oil burn on airplanes is about 1 quart in 5 hours. The original stamp caps burned a gallon an hour. So we've got a 12-gallon oil tank. And oftentimes they had to land in that oil, not just gas, which was get them to the next stop. They flew these airplanes religiously from New York to, from San Francisco to Chicago, that being contract Airmail Route 18, and they flew CAM 8, Seattle to San Diego, the shirt that I'm wearing now is the flight that we flew last May. So CAM 8 and CAM 18 were Boeing's big money makers. He made money right out of the chute and proved that this air-cooled engine and carrying people and airmail would make sense. I did some math here real quick, and to mail a letter in 1918, it was 25 cents. If we put that into perspective, that's $6.12 today. It's pretty expensive. So mail today is still a bargain. A fully loaded Boeing 40 in 1928, the year that our airplane is, would yield the post office about $18,000, which was a huge amount of money. So think about what's up front. And that's, take 18K times, 85 years. That's a lot of money today. So that's an interesting little factoid. With that said, let's see. Yes?
You can see where the passengers sit. Where's the mail?
The mail's ahead. There's 2 doors in the side. That's steerage in the back. That's a little cramped. And then up front is first class. That's slightly less cramped. And then the mail is where those 2 leather straps are up front. The airplane carries 750 pounds of mail. Actually, our airplane carries 749. I thought it was really funny. In the crash site is a data plate that was in the mail kit that says max load 749 pounds. So I went to the FAA when we restored the airplane and I asked for a 337 field approval to increase that load to 750. They rejected it. I just thought that was some guy with a slide rule. I mean, really, 749? Like, they really did that? I can't believe it. It carries 140 gallons of gas, 60 gallons. The upper right wing is longer than the left wing. There is no center section. So you got a long right upper and a shorter upper left. And the gas tank, 60 gallons is up on top. And there's 2 40-gallon tanks in the 2 lower wings. So you have to select various. It burns about 34 gallons an hour. Ironically, we flew down here yesterday on our Drum and Goose, and I figured out it's cheaper to fly the Goose from Spokane to Hood River than to fly the Boeing 40. The 40 burned more gas coming down here than the Goose did. Because the Goose does it in 1 hour and 50 minutes, and the Boeing was 2 hours 45 and 34 an hour. We did the math. So we're actually making money yesterday. And we did that works out. And divide that by seat miles, it really becomes economical. The other things we did, of course, I mentioned we did add a tail wheel. The airplane originally had a tail skid. And if you guys have ever flown tail skids, it's very stabilizing. Once that tail's down and sticks back, the airplane does not round loop and go straight. Our tail wheel has a lock in it. It's from a twin beach, so I drop a pin, and that tail wheel is locked straight ahead. When that tail comes down, the landing's over, it goes down the runway like an arrow. If you unlock that tail wheel, you don't have a tail wheel, you have a block of ice cube that decides to do whatever it wants, and the airplane goes crazy. So you only leave that unlocked a few times, Larry. You know about locking tail wheels. The other thing we did put modern brakes on it. Those are Cleveland modern brakes. The airplane has brakes like your grandmother's Cadillac. You can just scan the thing, which makes it very safe to operate. The more modern engine, radios, the rest of the airplane is historically exactly as it was the day it crashed in 1928. It was flown by a man named Grant Donaldson. He was in the back seat. He had a passenger in the left front seat named R.A. Donovan. They were flying from Medford to Portland, and just north of Grants Pass is a town called Canyonville. You guys may know Canyonville well. And there's a little big notch there that you fly through. And they started hitting the trees, and they cut trees down for a mile before the airplane hit a big snag, went into the hill, and burned. And R.A. Donovan was killed instantly. Grant got out of the back seat and tried to get him out. In the process, his nose and ears were burned off. He was wearing his winter flying suit. He hiked down from the mountain, and what is today Interstate 5 is a 2-lane gravel road. And a minister with his 10-year-old daughter saw this guy come out of the forest. He must have looked like Sasquatch. I can imagine he's delirious. He's horribly disfigured, and they took him into the town of Canyonville. He spent a year in Harvard. It's amazing. They sent a plastic surgeon from Austria to reconstruct his nose and ears. He then went to work for United Airlines, became a station manager in Bakersfield, eventually in San Francisco, and retired after a full working life at 67 years old. He lived to be 92. When he was flying for Pacific Air Transport, a division of Boeing Air Transport, they couldn't make payroll and gave him Boeing stock. And when he died, his predecessors found this Boeing stock and it was worth $800,000. In 2008, John Bevan, who is here, and I flew the airplane back to Spencer, Iowa. That's Grant Donaldson's hometown. We went to the family reunion and gave all of his descendants rides in the airplane. And they gave me, it's emotional to say this, but they gave me all the original logbooks and all these artifacts, which are family treasures that we still have. And he had a niece, a lady named Doris Hemphill, and she was 96, and she rode in the airplane. And she remembers very, very clearly the Donaldson Brothers Flying Circus, prior to their Airmail work, had done a rope ladder to speedboat transfer on Spirit Lake in Iowa. And she was the one that took a picture. She hands me the picture. She says, I was 15 when I took this picture, and these earrings Grant gave me when I was 15 years old. And so I had her, I threw the airplane, and she goes, we got to go recreate this. So I flew over Spirit Lake, and she gets on the intercom, we got to go lower. And I go, we can only go 1,000 feet. A lot of people, no, we need to get right in the water, just like they were. She was quite upset that I wouldn't buzz the lake. Do that, we have a thing called the FAA now. So that's kind of the story there. I've got any questions you want to answer? And again, I got the fact that I am married because of that. So yes.
Do you have another presentation put together on the restoration process?
I do. It's quite extensive. Yes. If you go to YouTube and you Google Boeing 40, there's a program I did for Museum of Flight that runs about 45 minutes. It's very, very detailed about the restoration. Things like the airplane was arc welded, which was remarkable. And all of the welds are not coincidental. If a tube intersects another tube, it comes clear through the tube and it's welded on the backside. It more mechanically holds it than the weld. Some of the material science, the airplane is chromoly 4130, which people said didn't exist in 1928. It does. There's even heat treat criteria. And a lot of the metallurgy, it's interesting. You read some of these metals and you have to find what the modern equivalent is, like 24ST. And some of these alloys, we had to look at some of the old books to find out what the alloy equivalent is today. So yes, if you go on YouTube, you can, if you're not tired of listening to me talk now, there's quite a very good presentation of the Museum of Flight did. And if you have real interest, I can send you a DVD of the whole thing. Just let me know and give me your address. Yes? Susie?
Your photo shoot with the 777.
Yes, yes. 787.
Would you talk about that? Because we all know it's Photoshop.
Thing is not Photoshop. Yeah, very good. Part of the Boeing experience was a relationship we developed with Mr. Boeing, who passed away 2 years ago. And at the time, the president of the Boeing Aircraft Company decided that they'd like to get a picture of the oldest and the newest Boeing in formation over Mount Rainier. And they arranged a photo shoot where we actually arrived at 13,000 feet. We got to Mount Rainier and the weather was terrible that day, and we decided it was an abort. And Mike Carricker was flying serial number 001, Boeing 787. And we're on Boeing company frequency, and I get on there, and we're in these little tight area there. We can see Mount Rainier, but we're kind of in a cloud bubble. And I say, this isn't going to work for a big airplane. And he goes, you tell me where to go, I'm going anyway. I hope he opens the throttle, and he goes, tell me where to go. And we had my son Jay in the 185, and he found a lawn lab over Puget Sound. And we're up there at 13,000 feet on top of the overcast, and here this image comes up through the undercast. And my first impression was, that better be him. And then the next vision I had was him climbing and rolling into about a 30-degree left bank turn. And that 87 looks like a Nimbus. My son said it was the Connie of the millennium. It looked as beautiful as a constellation. The wings were arced up like a Connie, and I mean like a Nimbus fighter. And he cracks that thing around and made the first pass. I was flying off of an A-36 Bonanza with the doors off. My son took pictures. And he made 3 overtakes on it, a pass. And my son clicked and clicked and made 3 passes. And by the 3rd pass, Carricker knew that we were going to kill him. And he was stepped down, of course. And I could see the buttons on his shirt. And everybody's in the window, all plastered against the window. Whoa, Bevan was in the airplane with me and took a picture from inside our airplane. I don't show those pictures publicly because if people didn't understand, they'd think there was an element of recklessness about us. But anyway, that was pretty awesome. And then he was gone. It was like a vision. You know, did this really happen? I'm like, oh yeah, that really happened. And then that was a remarkable experience. Thank you, Sue. Okay, with that said, we can walk out to the airplane. If you guys have an interest, I'll show you a bit about it. Thank you. 6,200 pounds. Its empty weight is 4,100, so it's got a pretty respectable, useful load. The question was answered, where does the mail go? That's in this pit here. These fold-down catwalks are used for servicing the oil. On the other side, it's for servicing the mail pit. And inside the hangar was the original cart that they would use to load the mail. This big muff you see back here is the carb heat source that encompasses the exhaust manifold. The original propeller was a fixed pitch. We've put a constant speed on here in the interest of safety. Those original engines with the fixed pitch propeller would really limit the horsepower on takeoff. In that we're flying the airplane out of some smaller airstrips. We wanted 600 horsepower on takeoff that we can get now. So it accelerates quite aggressively. Takeoff run is about 600 feet, even at gross weight. We left Rock Springs in 2008 with a density altitude of 9,000 feet. And Larry had unloaded everything out of the C-3B, and I had a number of passengers in the cabin. And the airplane rolled 1,100 feet. It was airborne, climbing at 700 feet a minute at 9,000 foot DA. And I turned over Rock Springs and thought, my goodness, these guys had this thing right. Appreciate this airplane was designed with a slide rule. And initially in 1925 and refined again in 1927 and 1928. There were a total of 81 Boeing 40s built. This is the only one flying in the world today. And again, it's Boeing's first commercial success. In the words of Bill Boeing Jr., without the Boeing 40, the Boeing Aircraft Company would not exist today. My sons both fly the airplane, Jay and Ryan both, which I'm very proud of. I guess they were impressed when I flew it initially, and after they flew it, it was so pleasant that they are not so impressed anymore. The biggest challenging part of the airplane is, again, the forward visibility is non-existent. You'll notice Vanessa, when we landed, it's a pretty aggressive side slip. The narrower the runway, the longer you carry that side slip into landing. And then we can three-point it on the grass. It works out nice. On asphalt, I typically stand it up so I can get situational awareness. There is a telephone system in the airplane that lets you talk to the pilot. And there's There's 2 people up front, slide windows. It's quite comfortable inside as far as leg room, but people didn't have McDonald's back then, so the girth is a little limited, as is my length of my cord. These are cowl flaps that I can orchestrate from inside the cockpit, and we can also wind this thing with an electric starter, which it had in 28, and it's an inertia starter that winds up and then you engage a clutch. As an option, we can put this hand crank in here and wind this up and pull this T-handle and release the clutch if we have a dead battery. It again carries 140 gallons of gas, burns about 34 an hour. So we planned 3 hours as kind of max. I'm pretty well looking through an airport at about 2.5 hours. If I'm not on the ground at 3 hours and 15 minutes, I'm kind of an emotional mess. I've flown it about 3 hours is the longest, and I probably had 20 gallons left. You get below 20 gallons, you're kind of sweating bullets. It's into that magic hour that we don't like. Let's see, what else? Yes?
What do you use the flares for?
That's if the engine quits at night, you detonate the flares and that illuminates the ground so you can see where your crash site's going to be. Take that wire between the ailerons and wiggle that for me, just as a mode of interest. Yeah, go ahead and wiggle that side to side. See how loose those wires are? Initially, when we built the airplane, we had those wires pretty tight. And as the airplane got to cruising speed, the ailerons got very, very stiff. And I found a service letter, an old Boeing service letter, those are actually quite loose. And they're not streamlined by purpose. As you increase the airspeed, those things will arc back and increase the aileron tension. And it's a technique that'll help reduce the flutter on the airplane, which was kind of unknown in those years. But you get those things to about 150 miles an hour, and those things are bowed back like you can't believe, and the ailerons start pinching, which is of interest. Lots of wires, lots of struts, and let's see, what else? Any questions about the airplane?
Cruise speed?
Cruise speed 125. It'll go faster, yeah, miles an hour. If you want to go faster, it gets pretty prohibitive. It takes about 28 inches and about 19 turns to get it to fly decent. If you get the power back much below about 30 gallons an hour, it just drags its rear end and mushes through the air. So it takes that much power to get it to fly up on what we'll call the step, which we're not supposed to say exists, but we all know it does.
When do you fly it again?
When will we fly it again? Well, we flew it this morning, and we may fly it this evening. We'll fly it again tomorrow. We're giving rides for all of the volunteers that Terry, Jay, and Judy asked me to do that. So I'm working for them. I'm a paid pilot. We'll fly for food and gas. Yes.
I see on the nose bowl there's a bunch of louvers. Is that a moving shutter?
That's a winter shutter. In the wintertime, you can actually close that and get the oil temp up. There's actually a shutter on the oil cooler as well. So you can actually, in the cockpit, you have, of course, a throttle and a mixture and a propeller control. You have a winter shutter for the nose. You've got an oil shutter, and you got cowl flaps. So you're juggling cowl flaps, winter shutter, oil cooler, and power settings. So pilots love doodads, lots of things. That's why I fly a Grumman Goose. It's got more levers.
When do you find time to blog about it?
Yeah, you blog about it while you're driving along. That's right. And here in the audience today is Matt Burrows. He built my fuselage. Tom Jensen built our gas tanks. A number of my Boeing volunteers are here as well. John Bevan did all of the woodwork inside. Jim Miller built my doors. So there he is, my door guy. And Bevan, our wood guy. And Bevan painted this airplane. Jim Miller painted the airplane as well. So anyway, thank you for your attention and interest.
Thank you.